My name is Godwin Opinde. I'll be moderating this session. So just to know who is participating in this webinar, we request you to type your name on the chat box and the organization. So your name and your organization, so that you're able to keep a list of attendance for the webinar. Secondly, during the Q&A session, you will be given opportunity to air your comments or questions, and you'll be required to use the reaction buttons that are available. But then as the presenters will be going on with the presentation, you are also free to type in the chat box questions and comments, which we will also follow as which we'll respond to during the Q&A session. I wish to welcome you again. And the topic today is extended producer responsibility, solution to plastic waste management in East Africa. Is it a solution to plastic waste management in East Africa? This conversation and webinar is coming on the backdrop of the strategic plan for INIS. For those who are joining and may not be aware, INIS is East Africa Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement, which has in its composition the regulating authorities from different countries on matters of environment. It has also NGOs of interest, academia, and in their strategic plan, one of the key priority program for the strategic plan 2020-2025 is minimizing adverse impact on chemical and waste. So it's the backdrop of this that we are having this webinar on extended producer responsibility. And we expect by the end of this webinar, we'll have gained knowledge on EPR, but also have exchanges and also share in terms of practices from different countries, and also learn from each other and build up towards meeting some of the objects of the strategic plan 2020-2025 for INIS. At this time, I'd welcome, if you look at your program, we have the opening remarks, and the opening remarks would be from Mr. Robert Orina, who is the Chief Enforcement Officer from NEMA. And so I'll welcome him to give the opening remarks. Welcome, Mr. Orina.
Okay, thank you, Bwana Godwin. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, so colleagues, as a long-time practitioner of compliance and enforcement and a member of INIS, I'm particularly delighted to be part of this initiative of knowledge sharing. And I want to underscore the fact that the environmental threats we face as a region have never been greater. Globally, environmental compliance and enforcement is gaining more and more attention due to the public awareness, and there is now a lot of pressure as many countries recognize environment as a human right. So governments are seeking more action to reduce environmental pollution, and they are taking necessary steps to protect public health and the environment. Usually the response is the passage of laws, development of standards, and the coming up with various policies. For example, the government of Kenya has been globally hailed for the bold step it took to ban single-use plastics and carrier bags. Though this did not come easy, as there was a lot of spirited fights and efforts by the private sector and other stakeholders to keep the status quo. Of course, the journey of plastic control has been a long one coming. We've tried a lot of various policies, directives that have failed in the past due to the difficulty in enforcement. And it should be noted that the ban came about as a result of a lot of frustrations from unsustainable consumption of plastics and poor waste management systems in the country. So the ban successfully managed to divert a good amount of plastics from the environment. It lacked the supportive tools of good waste management practices throughout the value chain. And to address this gap, the government of Kenya has developed several tools which are at various stages of law enactment process. And one such a tool is the extended producer responsibility, which is the subject matter of discussion today. Therefore, it's my pleasure and hope that this dialogue will enable us to interrogate the tool with a view of understanding how it will fill the gap and how it can unlock the circularity potential of materials through recycling. And as I finish, colleagues, let me also point out that INIS, as a network of compliance and enforcement in the region, we are really committed to provide a platform for exchange of knowledge and engagement for the betterment of our environment. And clearly, these initiatives is just but the start. There are more other engagements planned and work that is yet to come. And it's my belief that in the coming weeks, you'll be hearing more from the INIS Secretariat, so that as a region, we are at a point of knowledge and understanding on how we tackle some of these challenges that are giving our region a lot of challenge. So I want to really appreciate the organizers of this meeting and the sponsors, because this is the only way that we can exchange knowledge in the region and be able to share the best practices so that we manage the environment. So with those few remarks, I want to really invite all of us to participate in this meeting and give our ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rina, for that elaborate introduction, remark. This time, we'd move to the next segment of the presentation. And the keynote presentation is on extended producer responsibility. And we are looking at it and we're asking ourselves, is it an effective policy tool for plastic waste management in East Africa? And to take us through this is the ECI Executive Director, Jerry Opondo. And I'd welcome Jerry Opondo to proceed with this presentation. Jerry, welcome.
Thank you very much, Godwin, and thank you very much, Mr. Rina, for the opening remarks. Just as I begin, I would like, first of all, to extend my gratitude to colleagues who have joined this call today. We have colleagues I've noticed from Rwanda, from Burundi, from Tanzania, both mainland and Zanzibar, Uganda, and Kenya, where we are presenting from today. So it gives us, great pleasure to be part of this. So today I'll be taking you through this presentation, and let me just go back one step. Yeah, so our topic for today is on the subject of extended producer responsibility. And as Godwin already said, it is more of a question rather than an answer. So we are asking ourselves whether this could actually be a possible solution to the waste management challenge in East Africa, with very specific focus on plastics. Thank you very much. So just as a quick general background. In East Africa, generally, the waste management situation is quite inefficient, with most of our countries struggling with the waste management challenge. And this is more so, especially in the rapidly growing urban areas, as well as, and this is also exacerbated by the high population growth rates in our countries. And if you look at most of East African countries, our waste is generally dumped in open dump sites. Hardly do we have, sanitary landfills in most of our urban areas. So it's either a designated open dump site by the municipality, or in many other cases, illegal dump sites that have just sprawled by people throwing trash in those particular places. However, some of the waste, smaller fractions, are handled through incineration, composting, and recycling. However, generally, the recycling capacity is extremely low across all the East African countries. Now, just quickly taking the Kenya example on our waste management situation. Our average per capita waste generation currently stands at about 0.39 kilograms of waste a day per person. And on an annual scale, then this translates to about every Kenyan generating 142.35 kilograms of waste per annum. Now, when you go into the residential sector, then the waste generation rate from residential areas is, and this basically encompasses both rural and urban, at 18,564 tons of waste per day, which in effect translates to about 6.8 million tons per annum. Now, onto this, you have to add the waste generated from commercial establishments such as hotels, restaurants, shops, schools, etc., which generate an additional about 4,641 tons of solid waste a day. In turn, this coming to about 1.7 million tons per annum. In terms of waste collection rate, for Kenya, in the rural areas, available data indicates is as low as 1.5% of waste generated that is collected, while for the urban settings, it's about 55%. In terms of waste composition, again, data is always a challenge for much of East Africa. And for Kenya, the data available is mainly from three of the largest cities, that is Nairobi, Mombasa, and Kisumu. And if you look at this table, then you realize with a focus on plastics that on average, about 10% thereabouts of our waste in the three key cities is from plastics. So Nairobi at 9.5%, Mombasa at 12.6%, and Kisumu at 10.2%. And I want to believe that this sort of information is typical of any other urban setting within East Africa. Even if we got data for each city, it would not vary so much from what we see in the three Kenyan cities that I've just shared with you. When it comes now to plastic waste in East Africa, again, I want to point out that all the EAC nations have, quickly growing industrial sector, with plastics manufacturing forming a key subsector. And this subsector supports the economies of these countries in many ways. For example, through employment creation, through foreign exchange earnings. Kenya, for example, exports much of its plastics to the rest of EAC, all the way into the DRC, and as a result, earns foreign exchange through this. But then the plastics subsector also supports other key sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and trade, either through provision of raw materials or provision of packaging materials for these other sectors. However, despite this contribution to the economies, plastics forms one of the major threats to the natural resources base of the East African countries. And as all of you might know, and if you are part of the webinar last week, many of our economies are very heavily dependent on our natural resources base. And these are more and more threatened by pollution from different sources. And plastics happens to be one of the key sources of pollution that is threatening our biodiversity and ecosystems. Over the years, the main plastics that have been a challenge to the waste management problem in East Africa, especially in the major towns and cities, have been plastic carrier bags and plastic bottles, as well as other plastic packaging materials. And why are these the most problematic plastic items? Mainly because these are the ones that are most prone to littering. It is highly unlikely that you will come across a plastic chair or a table discarded on the roadside, but you are more likely to come across plastic carrier bags or PET bottles for that matter. Now, looking at how plastics have been managed in Kenya, I want to share with you this Sankey diagram that has been sourced from a recent study that was concluded recently by WWF. And if you look at the plastic mass flow situation for Kenya, then you really get a worrying trend. Because if you look at this diagram and look at the central part, then quickly it informs you that annually Kenya generates up to 982,580 tons of plastic annually. But then in terms of how this is managed, if you look at the far end on the bottom right, then you realize that up to 903,907 tons of plastic waste is mismanaged, either burnt in the open or buried into the environment. About 63,000 tons is littered openly into the environment. About 50,000 going into the municipal dump site, and just a very small proportion up on your left side, 21,000 tons being the portion that is recycled annually. And this, again, as I said, is more likely representative of the situation in many of our East African countries. In terms of policy approaches that have been applied to waste management and specifically for plastic waste, the East African countries have applied different mechanisms. Some of them are common to the countries, but some are specific to each country. But generally speaking, if you look at the general waste management regulations across the board in all the East African countries, then you realize that there are obligations placed on waste generators to minimize waste at source. So for plastics waste, again, if we were able to minimize this at source by applying the obligations under the respective legislations, then this should actually be able to work. But then the regulations also have certain obligations on waste handlers as well as disposal sites. So whether you are a transporter or you are an operator of a disposal site across the board throughout EAC, then you have to abide by certain requirements, either by national legislation or by local or city bylaws. Now, coming specifically to plastics, this has been a very long journey for East Africa. So one of the policy approaches that has been applied across most of EAC is the imposition of standards for thickness of plastic carrier bags. So for example, in Rwanda, when they banned the plastic carrier bags in 2005, the ban basically was against plastics of thickness of less than 100 microns. Now, Zanzibar did the same in 2006, Kenya 2007, and Uganda in 2009 through the Finance Act of 2009. And in all these three countries, again, the limit was at 30 microns. So the ban was on manufacturing use of plastic carrier bags of less than 30 microns. Now, at the same time, these countries have also tried to apply economic instruments. And this has mainly been in the form of punitive taxation. So in Kenya, for example, by the Finance Act of 2007 and Uganda by the Finance Act of 2009, a punitive excise duty of 120% of the excise value of plastic carrier bags was imposed. Now, lately, many of our countries have now resorted to what I would call, more drastic and stringent measures. So, for example, one of the actions that has been common is bans or prohibitions. And Rwanda did ban the carrier bags way back in 2005 and has been implemented, quite vigorously. Uganda did the same by the Finance Act of 2009. But then in terms of implementation, of course, there has been, a lapse there. Kenya did issue a similar ban in 2017 with Tanzania following suit in 2019. One additional step that Kenya has taken is, for example, the ban of use of plastic bottles, straws, and related products within wildlife protected areas. And this was imposed in 2019 and took effect in July 2020. Also, generally, when it comes to littering, our waste management laws and regulations across the board in EAC, as well as city level and local level legislations and bylaws, all have prohibitions related to littering. So again, this is kind of the legislative and the regulatory landscape currently in existence. Now, despite the existence of many of these, legislative and policy interventions that I have just mentioned before, you realize walking around East Africa that it has not been a walk in the park. And this can be attributed to quite a number of challenges. And so these I call the challenges of current policy approaches. And number one is basically the design gaps and challenges. And topmost among these is the lack of consensus on the legislative design for plastic waste management. And in discussions that I've had with people around Kenya, around East Africa, there's really no consensus on how we should go about managing plastic waste. One school of thought is of the view that existing waste management legislation actually is sufficient to deal with plastic waste. Because if plastic waste is considered as part of the general solid waste management stream, then this school of thought, argues that there is no need for plastic-specific legislation. All we need to do is to effectively and efficiently implement existing waste management legislation. But then, if you look at also some of the existing policies and legislations on plastic, then you realize that there is also a bit of ambiguity in terms of the scope of some of the measures. So if you look at, for example, the plastics bags ban in Kenya of 2017, it bans the use, manufacture of plastic carrier bags and flat bags without clearly defining, what are carrier bags, what are flat bags. The ban does not mention anything about possession, about importation, and trade. Yet, in terms of implementation and enforcement, these aspects have actually been covered in the ban. And because of this lack of clarity, I remember, NEMA Kenya had to come up with, like a checklist, trying, to explain what exactly the ban covers and what the ban doesn't cover. Then in the explanation, NEMA went ahead to even grant exemptions, for example, on what are they called? Linings for garbage, as well as, carrier bags in duty-free shops. Yet the text of the ban itself does not mention any of this. Now, if you look at the second ban relating to use of single-use plastic items in wildlife protected areas, again, it talks about plastic bottles, straws, and other related items. Now, the question that stands out is what is covered under this statement, other related items. And if you go around, East Africa in the various legislations, then you find, this kind of ambiguities in existing laws. And this has been a challenge for implementers. Now, there are also the second set of challenges that I call implementation challenges. And number one is competing priorities in the various countries, basically a competition between environmental protection versus economic growth. And I do remember, the fight that has always been the case in Kenya between the Ministry of Environment, NEMA, the Manufacturers Association. And the rallying point for the manufacturers usually has been that, if you impose this ban, if you impose this tax, if you limit, the thickness, this is likely to impact on, production. It's likely to impact on, jobs, and so many people are likely to lose employment and all that. So if you look at, for example, the 2007 excise tax imposed by Kenya at 120%, 2 years later, by the year 2009, through the Finance Act of that year, the government had actually come back and amended that to a paltry 50%, basically due to pressure from the manufacturers. At least for the ban, the government stood its ground, despite various litigation and all that, and finally the ban took effect. And for Uganda, again, I think that has been the case because despite the limits to the thickness of plastics having been imposed in 2009, actual implementation didn't quite take off. Now, I would also say that there is an implementation challenge relating to poor coordination among relevant state agencies, inadequate capacity for monitoring and enforcement across the board. Most of our environmental regulatory agencies do not have sufficient resources in terms of personnel. just from basic numbers to, even vehicles to move around and do surveillance and, just enforce existing legislation. Then there is also generally, low public awareness, for example, about the impact of plastics on the environment, human health, etc. So sometimes when measures are put in place, it takes quite a long time to get the public behind, some of these measures. So this is basically a headline that hit the ground in August 2017, shortly after the imposition of the ban on the plastics, single-use plastics, basically the carrier bags and flat bags. And there was a lot of I think there was a lot of hype, both locally and internationally. And, we thought, that we had finally found a solution. But then look at the same newspaper about 1 year, 4 months later, in December 2018. The headline here is, "What ban? Plastics trade still thriving in Western Kenya towns." And therefore, this basically means that even with the ban, I mean, there is still, it's still out there, whether this has been, really successful. If you ask me, walking downtown Nairobi and, some of the informal settlements, lots of these banned plastic carrier bags are still in place. If I go to my village in the western side of the country that borders Uganda, lots of this is still coming in. And also through the lake, I guess, from Tanzania. And the question is, how is it, for example, that there is a ban in Tanzania, yet some of these plastics is still, crossing borders from Tanzania into Kenya? So these are, things that as a region and as a compliance and enforcement network are things that, we need to consider and, start talking about. So this brings me now to the topic of the day, extended producer responsibility. And, as we said, we are basically just throwing the question out there. Could this, be the solution to the plastics waste challenge in East Africa? Now, EPR, as you may already know, is an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product is extended to the post-consumer stage of the product's life cycle. And it's actually an embodiment of the polluter pays principle, in that, whoever generates or causes pollution should be responsible for the cost of prevention, cleanup, and even payment for damage that may result from their actions. And therefore, when it comes to EPR, it seeks to shift the responsibility of the post-consumer stage of the product life cycle through two main policy interventions. So the first one is basically to provide incentives to producers to incorporate environmental considerations in product design and therefore minimize waste generation from the word go. But also assuming that products will inevitably get into the market, then producers are required to put in place a take-back mechanism that requires them to be able to assume the economic burden of managing the potential adverse impacts of their products through a take-back, collection, recycling, and possibly final disposal mechanism. And the end goal of EPR is basically to achieve circularity, a circular economy as we know it. So this diagram basically illustrates a simple basic idea of an EPR system where you have producers, consumers, and waste management operators as a part of a system. And here, producers then would generally be anybody who, puts a product into the market. Could be, a domestic manufacturer, could be an importer, could be, retail outlets and all that. Then you have consumers, and then you have waste management operators. Now, looking at our current legislative frameworks, I think we already have a good foundation for EPR uptake in East Africa based on our current legislative and policy frameworks. If you look at all the EAC countries, we are party to various multilateral environmental agreements that either encompass the polluter pays principle or generally seek to prevent marine pollution. For example, the UN Convention for Prevention of Pollution from Ships, that's MAPOL. We have the London Convention, we have the Basel Convention, Stockholm, and many others. Now, when you come down domestically, then again, many of our constitutions have been made in the 2000s. And I would call these quite progressive constitutions because some of them, like the Kenyan one, enshrines sustainable development as a key national principle and value of governance. Again, majority of the EAC constitutions guarantee the right to a clean and healthy environment, which include the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through legislative measures. Again, the respective national framework environmental laws, e.g. Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, all embrace the polluter pays principle, which is really the foundation for EPR. And all the EAC states have some form of waste management laws and regulations. So in my view, this actually forms a good basis for establishing EPR systems within our countries. So when you talk about EPR, it can be either at individual level or at collective level. The most common form of extended producer responsibility is on a collective scale, where producers come together in the form of a producer responsibility organization. And then through collective action and pooling of resources, they are able to engage with waste management operators to collect, sort, and recycle the waste generated from their operations. So comparing individual versus collective producer responsibility, then you realize that within the collective system, you have this organization called producer responsibility organizations that brings together all the producers. And then the PRO is the one that engages with the waste management operators. However, for an individual responsibility scheme, then the producer would have to set up their own systems for take back and recovery, collection, sorting, including recycling of waste. So there are different formats of EPR. Currently, if you look at the Kenyan situations, there is a bit of what I would call piloting of voluntary producer responsibility schemes. So the two main ones that are currently at play is the PET recycling company, popularly known as PETCO, that is basically concerned with PET bottles. And then you have also the Kenya Extended Producer Responsibility Organization that currently is more focused on the flexible plastics and more particularly the bread packaging. But in the context of a legally mandated extended producer responsibility scheme, then you need to have a legal and regulatory framework in place. And in this particular case, you need a regulatory authority that then oversees the system, that monitors, targets activities, and also imposes sanctions on any violators. And for this, you would basically need to establish an extended producer responsibility legislation, whether as standalone or as part of existing waste management legislation. So for Kenya, for example, over the past few years from 2019 till now, Kenya has been working on its extended producer responsibility regulations, and there is already in place an almost complete draft of 2021. And it categorizes, different products that are subject to extended producer responsibility, and plastics, particularly plastics packaging, forms part of those products that have been categorized as subject to extended producer responsibility. I know as we speak, I understand that, Uganda is generating, some guidelines with this respect. I'm yet to understand whether these are intended to be, just, guidelines that are unenforceable, or whether eventually this will evolve into enforceable regulations. In terms of implementing an EPR system, there are potential outcomes to this. And in this case, they are both positive, potential positive outcomes as well as potential negative outcomes. So the potential negative outcomes, and you can see the list, there are quite many, so it looks like they far outweigh, the potential negative outcomes. Number one being, reduced financial burden on municipal waste management authorities. Because of an EPR system that then helps to reduce waste generation, but also ensures that producers are able to take care of their waste throughout the product life cycle, the burden on the municipalities on overall waste management, collection, etc. is likely to come down. For environmental regulatory agencies like NEMA, again, the monitoring and enforcement burden is likely to be reduced. There is likely to be increased reusability and recyclability of materials because of change of design in products and packaging. And it is also expected that implementing an EPR scheme could lead to adoption of less packaging strategies in order to reduce the amount of waste requiring take-back. If you look at how EPR schemes work, taking, for example, the voluntary scheme under the Kenya Extended Producer Responsibility Organization, each company pays an EPR fee based on the amount of waste generated. So this basically then eats into the overall profits of a business. So it is more likely that businesses will try to reduce the amount of packaging and therefore spend less and less in terms of managing their waste. There is also likely to be, better waste handling practices. Currently, even though most of our legislations across East Africa mandate separation at source, that is really not practiced to a large extent. Now, for you to have an effective EPR system, separation at source is going to be key, so that the quality of products that are going into recycling can be guaranteed, and this is likely to be one of the positive outcomes. And of course, then there's likely to be increased collection and recycling. Negative outcomes, number one is likely rise in commodity prices. So the cost of product redesign or packaging redesign, or the cost of extended producer responsibility by the fees that then producers are going to pay for the management of their waste through the producer responsibility organizations, is likely to be loaded onto the product cost. And this may in many cases, see some changes in commodity prices. So a disadvantage to consumers generally. And two, sometimes there may be unintended environmental hazards. So with increased recycling and take back, we are likely to see more of these plastics being collected in central places in very, very large numbers. And as you all know, plastic is a petrochemical and highly flammable. So this could result in unintended hazards like fires. And with fires, of course, the attendant air pollution from the fumes that come from those. Now, just looking at East Africa now, and the question I ask myself is whether we are ready to implement an EPR system as a region. And I foresee, certain challenges. Number one being, inadequate basic waste management services. So an EPR scheme, presupposes, that there's proper waste collection systems, there are proper segregation and separation systems. And as I already said, currently, this is non-existent in most of our cities and towns. And therefore, even if we mandated an EPR scheme by law today, unless we fix basic waste management services by the municipalities, we are likely not to achieve the results intended by the EPR schemes. Then, there is also the attendant poor waste handling practices that then do not guarantee the quality of recyclables. So if we continue with our trends of mixing everything in one bin, like the recyclables together with the organics, then the quality of the material that gets out to be recycled is much, much more diminished. And if it is to be recycled, then the recyclers have to go an extra mile in trying to clean up this to a form that then can be recycled. The other challenge that I foresee for East Africa is informal sector integration. And a country like Kenya, for example, in many segments of the society, especially in informal settlements in our urban areas, the informal sector plays a very key role in waste management, from collection to recovery materials, etc. Yet, what I have seen, for example, in Kenya's draft EPR regulations, the draft EPR regulations has absolutely no space for the informal sector. Yet, in terms of recovery of recyclable materials, these are the people that play probably the most important role. So I would suggest that any country that is thinking of establishing an EPR system within the situation of East Africa, I think we cannot ignore the role of the informal sector. The medium and small enterprises may also likely face challenges, especially with the EPR fees applicable at the producer responsibility organizations. So it's important that critical thinking be made as to how then do you stagger the payment so that even the small and medium enterprises are able to participate. Otherwise, you end up with the freeloaders who generate waste, but then do not participate in any EPR system. And I remember some time back having a chat with the PET recycling company of Kenya, and what they collect vis-a-vis what their members generate cannot match. They collect much more than what their members generate, basically meaning that they collect even recyclables that are not part of their waste generated. And finally, in designing of EPR legislation, we need to critically think about it. whether we shall have, for example, an all-encompassing EPR law, or whether we will have a standalone law for each category. So for Kenya, I remember some time back, there was a proposal to have an EPR law applicable to e-waste, electronic and electrical waste. Then at some point, there was a proposal to have a plastic packaging waste management regulations that had elements of EPR. And then now we have an all-encompassing proposal to have everything under one roof. So each country needs to look at their situation and then determine what design best works for them. Now, in terms of conclusions, as I come to an end, my conclusion is that EPR alone cannot solve the plastic waste challenge in East Africa. What we need is an integrated approach that employs diverse policy approaches, and then these are implemented concurrently. So for example, you need an EPR scheme in place. You need bans of certain items where necessary. And you need economic instruments, for example, in terms of taxes or rebates and the like. So all these approaches need to be balanced in order to have a system that works. Waste management capacities, especially for the municipalities, should be enhanced. And for the regulatory agencies, implementation and enforcement of existing legislation should be prioritized. So the trend always has been that we quickly jump into new trends. So currently EPR seems to be the new trend, so everybody is jumping into it. But then we forget that even within existing legislation, we have simple things like separation at source that we are not implementing or enforcing. So unless we are able to fix current legislation, even coming up with new policy initiatives won't be of much help. And then finally, just like I said already, design an EPR system that takes into account each country's unique situation. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm open to any questions, as well as hear your ideas in terms of comments, discussions, etc. Thank you. Back to you, Gode.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for that elaborate presentation. At this juncture, we are going to get into the comment section and also questions. This is the way you're going to proceed in this section. You will be able to use the reaction buttons that are provided in the Zoom platform. You can raise your hand if you have a comment or a question or a suggestion. And also, if you're not able to use those reaction buttons, you can also type in. So thank you much, Jerry. And just to start us off, I'm not seeing any hands up. Okay, now as we proceed with this, maybe just to another question here. We'll actually share the presentation through the links that we provided, so you can also share your email addresses so that you'll share the presentation on the link. So once you click the link, you're able to get the presentation. Okay, so there's a comment from Tanzania. Tanzania is also in the final stages of developing guidelines on EPR as an instrument for implementation of regulation related to solid waste management. I think this is an opportunity we can give. This is a type from NEMC to just share on what they're doing as we wait for any other reactions.
Recently, because the issue of extended producer responsibility is the Vice President Office. As you know that in Tanzania, we have the Vice President Office and the National Environment Management Council. So recently, we just been starting developing the guidelines for the implementation of extended producer responsibility. So we are in the process of finalizing the extended producer responsibility guidelines, which will encompass type of waste. It's not specific to the plastic waste. So we are almost finalizing the development of those guidelines.
Thank you, and that's good step.
So I'm asking, are there avenues in which that we can, the CSOs that are working on the ground can reach out to help in implementing the new measures that you want to put in place, and also the legislation that is already available that's not being implemented? For example, separation at source and such, such things. How can we reach out and be involved in implementing the goals and the objectives of the organization?
Thank you. That's a question to not only Jerry, but also the regulators in the platform.
Exactly.
Yeah, so maybe we take another question, then we have a response. So Menan.
Thank you so much, Opondo, for that very good presentation, which was very informative. And as you have noted, the question of economy versus environment, I think the problem is where we are seeing all these challenges from the point of view of economy versus environment. And you have raised the important question of the interaction between these Eastern African countries. You have mentioned the point that at some point you are seeing products from Tanzania coming to Kenya, going to Kenya, but also there's the same problem that there are products from other Eastern African countries coming to Tanzania, especially for regions like Mwanza or Arusha. So unless all these countries have a common understanding of the problem, I think that's when we'll be able to achieve the same objective of prohibiting this plastic. But there's also another question that since the ban of plastic carrier bags in 2019 in Tanzania, business people have opted for a different kind of approach of using the same kind of plastic material for packaging, for carrying stuff. So they are using what they call it, wrapping materials as a carrier bags for products. So that's another challenge that we have observed here in Tanzania for such a long time since the ban was introduced in 2019. And the integrated waste management, if this can be achieved, especially if we have good system for separation, I think we'll be in a better position to have opportunities out of salt. And I think this is a big problem, and this is mainly attributed to different factors. Like you go back to the master plan or land use plan, in many places, they are not very much accommodative to ensure that waste that are collected and supposed to be transported to designated places is achieved. So you will find all these issues, all these plastic materials that are scattered in many different places, mainly because the land use plan or master plan are not very accommodative to ensure that separation is done at the source and the collection is done to those areas. Likewise, at the dumping place, I'm sure this is a common problem for many Eastern African countries, that even if you have good practice of separating waste at source, but at the final point, you don't find that kind of sanitary landfill that you can have appropriate system to ensure that this kind of waste is separated from this or such a thing. So the question I'm seeing is that if methods, systems are there that these producers take responsibility to somehow maybe create mechanism in which we can have locations where they can have their products collected, stored, and picked. And that can help to some extent. And in Dar es Salaam, for instance, there are companies that are producing colored plastic bottles. So they've been engaged by the National Environment Management Council as well as by the Vice President's office to ensure that they take charge, to ensure that the product or the plastic bottles that they are generating are collected and brought back to their facility. That's another kind of initiative that I'm seeing. But as you've noted, still we have very serious problem despite enactment of all this legislation and things like that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share what opinions we have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Menan. And maybe as we give the opportunity to the next person who has a question, there are two issues that are shaping up here, one, and even from the chat. A big question is how we can ensure participation of private sector or even CSOs, public benefit organizations, in the implementation of the guidelines or even regulations pertaining to this issue of EPR. And I think that will be better responded to by regulators, or Jerry, you can take that. And then also, what is the possibility of harmonizing these EPR guidelines within ESC?
Thanks for that. So let me just take up those first two. So number one, regarding the participation of other players that are not state players, and here I think I've heard about civil society organizations, private sector, etc. One thing that I would like to stress is that the opportunity is always there. Collaborate, and the evidence of that is this particular forum. You may want to know that the conveners of this forum and the current secretariat of the East Africa Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement is not a governmental organization, but rather a non-governmental, a non-profit, non-governmental organization. So we've had this long-term relationship with governmental authorities, not just in Kenya, but across the entire EAC. And we welcome many, many more partners from different players. As Godwin said at the beginning, INIS brings together not just government players, but non-governmental players like Isabel mentioned, private sector. So there is a role for everybody. So you can reach out through us. You can always, reach out to the regulators directly. And it's not just about, implementation and enforcement. It's also about, being active in the process for development of some of these policy measures. Because if we are able as non-governmental players to give our input from the policy inception stage, then we are able to use our expertise to help government get things better. Now, the question about economy versus environment, of course, that's always a tough one. And there is never that balance that you can say, this is it. But then I think that's really the whole question about sustainable development. Now, in terms of how an EPR scheme would work, as Dr. Menon mentioned, I think it is not in the role of producers to establish, for example, material recovery facilities. This is like a basic minimum that a municipal waste management organization, if it's a city council or a municipal council, should be able to establish. So just like municipalities provide waste disposal sites, they should also be able to provide material recovery facilities. And once these material recovery facilities are provided, then the producers are able, through their own networks, to come in and get their end of life products out of these material recovery facilities, so that then they can manage it in a better way. Yeah, so I think I want to leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Kenneth Rama's hand is up. Kenneth, you can ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Kenneth Rama from the University of Portsmouth in the UK. I'm a master's student studying crisis and disaster management. So I have a question, but also a comment. So with the comment is to echo the role of the public in waste management. There is the consumer choice, which is informed by their perception towards plastic products or waste even in general. There are cases where a consumer would refuse to purchase or to use a certain product just because it's plastic. And that comes from how informed they are regarding the plastic impact on the environment. So I think to strengthen waste management also can start with the public perception and public awareness on waste management and the role of plastic in pollution and even other health concerns. On the question is around environment versus economy. Yeah, this is a tough one, and I agree with Opondo. So one of the things that have been championed for is green economy. The economy is constituted by other smaller economies. So the small and micro enterprises, we have the green jobs, which can fall under that, which can potentially encourage innovation. So how to upcycle plastic waste, how to recycle, how to reuse waste, just so that it can be well managed. So the question is, has it got the potential to create the actual almost near balance of environment versus economy, where we're saying, yes, the environment needs to be protected, but then the economy also needs to thrive. But then we are now using the waste, the plastic waste that is coming from production and household lives to turn that into an economic incentive. So has that got the prospects that we'd want it to have? And what is the case in other countries? It would be good to hear what is being done on, in places like Tanzania, Rwanda. How is green jobs coming about? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. So I'll take a quick response and then, of course, open it up for colleagues from Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda to also share some experiences. But quickly, in terms of the potential of EPR, EPR is basically an embodiment of the circular economy principle. So if we are able to successfully and efficiently implement extended producer responsibility across all potential waste streams, from plastics to paper and cardboard to metals to many others, then eventually the amount of waste that leaks into the environment is totally or almost totally diminished. And by this, then, through processes like upcycling, recycling, etc., we are able to create many, many more jobs for the people that work within the waste value chain. And that's why, for example, I was stressing about the need to consider the informal sector, because they play a very, very key role in terms of material recovery. If we can figure out ways of incorporating them into the EPR scheme and help them take care of issues like safety and all that, and be able also to get better returns from their efforts, I think overall it does a great job for the economy, but also does a great job for the environment. Thank you. Back to you, Gori.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so I just wanted to support what Madam Saloma has just said. Currently, as a country, the EPR has not been formalized and become a law that we can probably try to use. So there's a challenge in terms of the structure, because we started clearing the industrial packaging. And then one of the conditions is that the users of those plastics have to show us proof of take back. And one of the proof that they have innovated is the associations or the people coming together, forming an association for a particular waste stream, and then they subscribe. And one of it is especially the plastics for the bakery and the conventionaries. where they have formed an association and they are subscribing. So they bring that as an evidence for us to clear them. But what we have noted, apart from that subscription, the organization or the extended producer organizations have no another role. They have not moved from just receiving the money, and the money is not small. So I think, as Salome, the fear we have is that they could be using regulatory agencies to get this money, and because we don't have a good structure, then that will again backfire on us, because if maybe somebody says I subscribed and therefore he expects the EPO to take charge and they're not taking, then the regulators will be at a loss in that. So I think the best thing as a learning lesson, as countries we develop these regulations, is also good to move quickly and develop structures that can avoid this misbehavior of maybe some organizations. Well, at the floor, another issue that we have learned, especially on enforcement of this plastic ban, is that, you know, in the field there, we have found some plastics maybe labeled other countries, our neighboring countries, and sometimes we have been probably saying that in the media that these plastics are coming from either Uganda or Tanzania. And one of the issues that we have found out, the industries are also very clever and they are innovative in a way. So they are playing into our own game where they even manufacture within Kenya, but they label it in Uganda or they label it in Tanzania, and then they distribute it locally, and then we keep on blaming neighbors. So I think there's a lesson we are learning there, that as enforcement teams in especially the East African region, we need to intensify our intelligence systems and get to know what's the material flow of these banned plastics. How are they flowing? Is it true that they are coming from each other country, or they are actually manufactured within, and then we are played games by the industries? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rina. That's great insight. Now let's have a comment from Rema. We have Betha, whose hand is up. Rema, Betha, your floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for a nice presentation. Mine is to share experience from our country, Rwanda. As I say, maybe it's mentioned on the screen. I'm Beata Kimhaye from Rwanda. I'm working in Rwanda Environment Management Authority, and I'm heading a division in charge of environment and compliance. This is to mean on rules and the regulation, even policies regulating the environmental protection. So, as I said, I wanted to share about the experience from our country, as now from 2008, our country has banned single-use plastic car bag. But from 2019, we have also banned single-use plastic, and as well as those plastic car bag. It was like an upgrading of the existing law of 2008. But as you said, the environment has no border. In the last month, I visited the Lake Kivu, but the main challenge was the deposit of different sort of plastic bottles in water bodies. And I was inspired by that plastic bottle deposit in the lake body, because I was saying, even if we are trying to ban single-use plastic carry bag and single-use plastic. But still, if our neighbors countries cannot participate in the same practice, we shall fail. So apart from the law that bans single-use plastic carry bag and the plastic single-use plastic, we have also initiated like I may say the two projects. We have a PET project. The PET project, because as you said, the economy also is a challenge, is a competition to environmental management or environmental protection, where we have seen that there is a need for packaging, where some product has no alternative packaging material. We are now encouraging private sector to develop an alternative, a sustainable alternative packaging to plastic materials, but yet the material is not on board now. So because of that crisis, people who have products without alternative packaging material, they request the authorization to import some plastic, especially some plastic bottles to package juice and water. But there is no industry allowed to produce those plastic bottles. So this PET project was initiated to manage those plastic being imported from other countries, but their waste management should be managed through this PET project, where every importer of those single-use plastic material have to pay 90 Rwandan francs per kilo of single-use plastic imported. You can say that this is part of Epr. It's a single component of Epr, if I may understand well, because this contribution will come to help through the private sector has mandate to create a recycling company that is able to recycle those plastics using those kind of contribution, that kind of money. And now private sector has signed an MOU with the Ministry of Environment and IREMA to speed up the activity of creating a recycling company, and yet they are the one to correct those plastic materials. But also, as we know that some products are coming outside our country, like cosmetic materials, like medical materials and the other products, they are coming in an international trade, because we can't ban international trade. They are coming in our country, being packaged in plastic materials. So now our country is initiating also, is going to impose the environmental levy on those products being imported, while they are packaged in single-use plastic materials or in plastic card bags. This kind of money also will be part of the contributing factor to the management of those plastic waste in the environment. Not only that, from last year, we have received a fund from UK government through Manufacturing Africa. They are also helping to develop a comprehensive EPR guideline, which will be a binding document. Even yesterday I was in a meeting talking about, discussing about the draft guideline on EPR or of EPR on plastic waste management here in Rwanda. So this is my experience that I can share, but it's a long journey when we want to manage in a sustainable way plastic materials, and it's a cooperation between countries. When Rwanda can achieve something and other neighboring countries are not able, we all know that we will fail in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bertha, for that very, very insightful sharing about Rwanda. And I like the last bit, that if you don't cooperate, then it's like a zero-sum game. Some voice from Uganda. Onyai, Fred.
Yes, thank you, Fred Onyai. My name, I work with the National Environment Management Authority in Nema, Uganda. We appreciate the very good presentation by our brother and colleague Jerry Pondo. We also appreciate all that's being submitted by our colleagues from the member states. Currently, as we talk now, in Uganda, we are having a workshop reviewing EPR guidelines that we are developing with the support from GIS and government of Uganda. But what I would like to say is that all that submissions have been made from Tanzania, from Rwanda, and other colleagues. It's all summed up that we need to have synergized and coordinated systems of management. I believe from all matters of environment and management, environment has got no boundary. It has got no political or administrative boundary. So it means the political blocks, the states, should come up with a uniform legal and management regime. It is just not enough to have scattered laws across the countries. Good enough to have possibly one regulatory framework for the entire ESC, and possibly also having harmonized guidelines, and possibly having one regime for enforcement, including monitoring and compliance enforcement. That will make it easier. When if you compare ESC block like other blocks like the EU, they do their things. I think we need a lot to learn from them. The waste management is also a cross-border issue. Waste move. As somebody has said, you can get a product labeled, Coca-Cola is labeled produced in Uganda, and you get the waste in Kenya or vice versa. What does that mean? It means there's a problem with the system. How do these labels move? So we can talk and talk, but if we cannot harmonize the system, and this goes beyond this discussion, I think INIS should help us and we engage the Council of Ministers. We engage ES Secretariat, that the issue of waste management, the issue of transparent management, we cannot just end them with that one unified system. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. I know members on the platform, I belabor you a little. I know we are past time. Okay, then as we come to the end of this, maybe Jerry, as you prepare to just have your reflections on, there are a couple of issues here. One, Crispin observes that awareness is really critical for waste management, and has a concern. And this question is, which way forward? His question is, what efforts are we putting past this kind of conversation for effective public sensitization on waste management? And I think if I flip it the other way also, what avenues are there that can be exploited by different organizations to actually help, work hand in hand with regulatory organizations to be able to increase awareness on waste management. There's also, I think is a question, from Salome, just kind of asking if there's any country within the region that waste segregation at source is successful, and is noting this because EPR actually its success is grounded on segregation. So segregation of waste at source is key. Those are the comments and the questions. So maybe before I give it to Jerry, maybe I go back to Beth. I can see your hand is up. Do you have any success stories of waste segregation at source in Rwanda?
Thank you again. I can say that I can't share more on the success story. I can even say there is no success story. But part of this EPR model we are developing, we have already initiated another project in Kigali. It was in, last week, where the project is intending to raise awareness on waste segregation from household or from the source, where the city of Kigali with their partners, we are trying to make it's like a pilot in 5 sectors of Kigali. But after 1 month, we are intending to extend it through the whole of Kigali and later on the whole country. But yet I can't say that it's that is something I can share like as if it's a success story. But we hope that as this is the beginning, but hopefully when the project is implemented and when the EPR guideline is developed and endorsed by our government, we shall enforce it and we shall check for its compliance because it's mandatory to EPR guideline success. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. Before we have the final reflections from Jerry, I think what we need to note, and I think Jerry alluded to it, is that EPR is not a silver bullet. We must use an integrated approach to management of waste. And back to you, Jerry, any reflections before we end this webinar?
Just maybe 2-3 quick ones. So first of all, is respect to that question that has just been addressed by Arthur and also Salome. And it's the question about segregation at source. And that's why in the middle of my presentation, I did stress the point that we cannot move to an effective and efficient EPR system unless we fix basic waste management services. And if we fix basic waste management services within current and existing legislative frameworks, where separation at source is mandated, but also, having, governments and municipalities enabling actual separation at source happening by, for example, providing different bins and all that, then, it will be difficult to implement a successful EPR system. Number 2, and I hope the government regulators here, NEM, NEMA, REMA, the Pollution Control Office in Burundi, ZEMA in Zanzibar, and everybody who is here today is really listening. If I listen from the previous interventions, for example, by Crispin, by Isabel, they're stressing more and more, the need of, education, awareness, involving communities, and involving non-governmental players. My experience from the side of the divide and from my previous side in government is that the government can't and will never be able to do it alone. So in your compliance promotion efforts, in your education and awareness efforts, I think it's an offer from the various interventions that you need to involve civil society and other organizations in this particular process. In terms of way forward, of course, this is a continuing discussion, and our role as ECI, as INIS, is to provide a forum where all the key players and stakeholders can come in and keep sharing information, experiences, and I believe together we shall come to common ground for the betterment of the environment in East Africa. And as Beta from Rema already said, and I think Dr. Menan also said that we cannot achieve it alone. Kenya alone trying to do something, or Tanzania or Rwanda or Uganda can't achieve it alone. So we need a cooperation framework where we can share intelligence, share information, have joint capacity building efforts, etc. And INIS provides that particular forum. So we want, as the Secretariat, to promise that we shall continue having these sorts of engagements, both virtually and hopefully very soon, also in person when the situation allows, so that we can build our region together. And finally, next week, I believe that should be Thursday and Friday in the afternoons, we shall be having a virtual webinar of, a virtual conference of INIS, where essentially we shall be looking at the strategic plan and working together with all of you stakeholders, the environmental regulatory agencies, together with us as the Secretariat. We'll look at the key priority areas going forward. What do we need to do? What do you want to hear more? What sort of engagements should we have, and all that. So invitations for this will be going out. Some have gone already, but if you haven't received already, you'll be receiving this shortly. So for everyone else who hasn't been part of our previous discussions and wish to engage more, please feel free to reach out. I'm just typing my email address down in the chat, and we'll be very happy to have you as part of these discussions going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jerry, and thank you, participants. There are those who are also interested in the recordings for the webinar. All those recordings will be hosted on the INIS website. So in the chat, I've put the link there. So once they're ready, you'll find them in the INIS website. Otherwise, I want to thank you for your time and also your contribution, and just wish you a nice afternoon. Those who are in East Africa, those who are different parts of the world, nice evening and nice morning. Have a nice day.